And is it okay to record?
Of course.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. We'll give everybody a couple of minutes to get in and we'll start right at noon today. Thank you all for joining us. And the chat is open, so if you all would like to chat with one another in there, feel free. We'll be using the Q&A feature for questions during the webinar. So if you have any questions that you want answered by Susie, feel free to put those in there as we go through the presentation.
I'm enjoying watching your turtles swim around, though. It's like a little maritime show for us before we get started.
I should zoom in on her and let that fill the screen for a little while.
Yeah, it'd be very soothing, very zen start to all of this. What's the turtle's name?
Kalula.
Kalula. Very pretty.
Exactly, Rebecca.
The nature moments, yes.
So I'll give folks another minute. We had about 60 registered, but I think some people were going to bounce in and out around other meetings. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We appreciate your making the time. My name is Cindy Tolosa, and I'm the project manager for the America 250 CT Commission and Development Officer here at Connecticut Humanities. Connecticut Humanities is the nonprofit organization administering the commission for the state of Connecticut, and we're excited to have Susie here with us today. Susie Wilkening is the principal of Wilkening Consulting, a museum audience research firm based in Seattle, Washington. She works closely with CTH to gather data on the cultural sector in Connecticut and was the analytical mind behind the 2022 nonprofit Connecticut Cultural Census. I'm sure many of you at this point have interacted with her in our many different surveys that we've been conducting. So Susie presented this information at a Common Cause to All, a national convening held this past March in Williamsburg, Virginia, by the Virginia 250th Commission. The audience greatly valued the information shared, and we knew it would benefit our Connecticut community. Wilkening Consulting also partners with the American Alliance of Museums to field the annual survey of museum goers, and is currently working on a census of academic museums and galleries and fields comprehensive research for individual museums. She's the author of Audiences and Inclusion, a primer for cultivating more inclusive attitudes among the public. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Susie to share Americans, Our History in the 250th.
Thanks, Cindy, and good afternoon, I guess, to all of you on the East Coast. I hope you're enjoying your lunch while you are attending this webinar. Back several years ago, I would say this was probably 2017, maybe in the fall 2017. I was attending the AASLH conference when a group of individuals from Virginia museums, Virginia historic sites, approached me and said, "Hey, there's this thing, the 250th, it's coming up." And I was like, yes, I had to do some math in my head, like, yes, oh, yes, the 250th is coming up. And they said, we want to kind of get a sense of how people may or may not be thinking about the 250th and how they might want to celebrate it. And I was like, that's a great question. So we put together kind of a research plan, and then they approached Virginia tourism to say, this is something we need. This is going to help with tourism in Virginia. And Virginia tourism said, yes, we will fund this. And it all came together. And so back, it ended up being in 2019 and early 2020, we fielded research. We fielded national research to start tackling this question about the 250th and the American population. So this is those research results from 2021, or sorry, from 2020, mostly pre-pandemic research. And then we're going to also bring it up to 2023 because there's some new things that are happening, some goalposts are shifting, and we'll talk about that too. So let's see here. We're going to make that bigger for you. There you go. Okay. So, that was our initial question. Will and how Americans want to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence? That seems like a simple question, but it actually is an incredibly complicated question. Because we figured out really quickly that this was a question about American patriotism and identity, and how that really shapes how people think about the past and those stories about the founding of our country. We went into mythology. There's a lot of mythology around our founding, bias, historical truth, and inclusive history. And thinking about what are those things that divide us and what are those things that might unite us as well. The research ended up being really complicated. I would say messy as in emotionally messy, because people have very complicated emotional responses to this. Those strong feelings were evoked across the spectrum of our population, including that political spectrum. There were three main takeaways, and that is that our individual values and attitudes and beliefs affect how we approach the past. And the divisions in our country extend to history. Now, we were writing this and doing this research back in 2019, early 2020. This was well before we started to have all the controversies and conflict around critical race theory in the classroom. That wasn't even coming up yet. So this is, before all that was happening and really going onto the radar screen of more and more Americans. It was already, we were seeing it then. That for most people, history is highly valued, but a lack of inclusion is a barrier to engagement for many. And this cuts both ways because it's lack of inclusion in terms of how we tend to think about it in the museum field. But it's also, and I'm going to really try to be careful with my words here, it's also perceived lack of inclusion from more conservative white heteronormative audiences too, because they feel like they're not being as included as they were in the past. There's a lot of complicated and conflicted feelings there. We're going to unpack those a bit as we go through this slide deck. And the majority of people do hold values of our country that they honor and respect and will want to acknowledge in 2026. However, there's not agreement necessarily about those values. We're going to go through the research methodology really quickly. If you really want to geek out about methodology, we can talk later. But just really quickly, what we did was we fielded 2 surveys. This is the big thing to remember, 2 surveys. One is what we call a survey of history museum goers. These are people who are connected enough with a history museum, in this case, a history museum in Virginia, that they are on that communications list, and they took time to take a survey on behalf of that history organization. Now, think about those Virginia-based history organizations. A lot of them have national audiences. Colonial Williamsburg, Monticello, Mount Vernon, just to name 3 off the top of my head. So while it was a Virginia-based history organization survey, only about a third of respondents came from Virginia. The rest came from the rest of the United States. Then there's another survey that went out at the same time, but that was to a purchased US broader population sample. So a sample that was reflective of US adults across the country. These are going to be non-visitors to museums. These are going to be casual and sporadic visitors. So this is going to be a little bit more representative of just the US population. So that was also fielded at about the same time. Then we did follow-up research that was qualitative. This is through what we call a qualitative panel. We bring people into a secure online space and ask really hard questions, and they pour their hearts out to us. It's amazing. We had 2 of those going on at the same time. One we drew from that survey of history museum goers. So these are these people who really love going to history museums and really were sharing about their thoughts about history. But we also fielded a broader population version with a lot of people who don't really go to museums to kind of get our finger on the pulse of just US adults more broadly. So we do designate where we're getting quotes and where we're getting our research from with these different words. So if you see broader, it's US adults. If you see museum goers, it's those really frequent engaged museum goers. So that's the methodology there. There was some other research that supported this. And we also want to note about sampling limitations. I'm not going to geek out about that. The original research presentation is a 3-hour research presentation. I'm not doing that today, but this kind of gives you an idea of the scope of all the research that we went into the field with. Instead, you're getting the highlights. This is more of the 45-minute version. But we have to really back up and start thinking about all of these different people who are or are not visiting history organizations and their individual values, attitudes, and beliefs, and how that affects how they engage with history and with our content. And all of us have our own unique blend, and they're all influenced by these different things that are going to be different for everybody. These are the big ones, but there's lots of other ones as well. Knowing that everybody's coming in with that unique blend, we still see, even though everybody's unique in their blend, a clustering of values. There are certain values, attitudes, and beliefs that tend to cluster together. And that's going to help us think through how different segments of the population are going to respond to content and how it's presented. The first clustering of values we want to talk about is this more traditional cluster. These are individuals who tend to be politically and socially more conservative. Not always, but they tend to be more likely to be that way. Tend to be a little bit less engaged with history than most other people. And I say that with an asterisk. You see the asterisk there. Within this segment, there is a group of people who are what we would call, they would self-define as history buffs, who tend to fit in this cluster. They tend to be really engaged with history, and we tend to see them at museums. But we have to remember that they are outliers in their peer group. And because they're so vocal, it feels like there's a lot of them, but they're actually way outnumbered by more traditional people who are less engaged with history overall. So just keep that in mind. Individuals, they generally are less engaged with their own community and with what events that are happening in the broader world. They're not paying as much attention. When it comes to inclusion, and here we're thinking about how we tend to talk about inclusion in museum world, or we're thinking about race and gender and religion and LGBTQ plus community members, things like that, they tend to be less inclusive. So they might be very anti-inclusive. They might be just sort of going with the flow, kind of, they call it the status quo, where everything you've done in the past has been great, no need to change it. They're not necessarily resisting change, but they don't see a need for change. So it's that less inclusive mindset. We're just going to leave it at that for now. We're going to come back to that. We're going to talk about patriotism later, but they tend to be what are called blind patriots. The US is the best country in the world, full stop. who tend to take a very celebratory approach to the past, a lot of pride in the past, very traditional approach to the past. They really liked how history was taught in school when they were a kid. They think it should continue to be taught that way, which is, of course, a very white heteronormative view of history. Overall, lower levels of curiosity, and demographically, they're more likely to be older, more likely to identify as men, and tend to have lower levels of educational attainment, but not always. That's just kind of how the trend goes, how these things tend to cluster. There's some other things we're going to add to this at the end of the slide deck, that some more traits about this group. The other end of the spectrum, we totally use a thesaurus word here, neoteric. That's because we didn't want to use the word progressive. It's a very political word, but it's not an inaccurate word. It's a more progressive mindset for this other end of that spectrum. Politically and socially more liberal, they tend to have higher levels of engagement with history, generally more engagement with the community and the broader world. They tend to be much more inclusive, that there are people who are more of that status quo, things have been fine the way they've been doing it mindset, but overall tend to be more inclusive. They tend to be more likely to be a symbolic patriot. We'll talk about what that means in a little bit. Their approach to history is more additive. They're like, okay, we had these stories we were taught in the past. Now we know that what we were taught in school, that's not the whole story. That's just part of the story. Let's add on these other details and get a more complex understanding of the past. That tends to be more of their approach. Higher levels of curiosity and demographically tend to be younger, more likely to identify as women, higher levels of educational attainment, but not always. This is just where they tend to cluster and where we tend to see variation. So those are those ends of the spectrum. And there are people in that middle group, that more status quo. That status quo group is actually more persuadable. And we're going to be talking about them as well. People tend to lean one way or the other. They may have a attribute that differs here and there, but most of the time, these clusters, these traits tend to cluster together and people lean one way or the other. That all affects how we view the United States and how we think about the past, and we're going to talk a lot about that. So let's look at those attitudes towards history. We're going to do this pretty quickly. When we looked at the broader population, so these are US adults, a lot of them don't visit museums very often or maybe at all. They still say, though, that history is valued and important. They acknowledge the importance of history. But when it comes to their leisure time, which is when people tend to engage with history, unless you're a historian, unless you're us, engaging with it in their leisure time, that's not very relaxing. And so that's why they tend not to do it as much, because they're looking in their leisure time for more relaxing activities. So if history is going to be compelling, if it's going to draw them in, they want it to be interactive. They want it to be hands-on. They really do like living history. It does not have to be first person, third person is perfectly fine, but they like that living history, those demonstrations, all that kind of stuff. And they want to feel good for learning something. Even if learning isn't their leisure time goal, once it's done, they want to feel good that they learned something. And they do want the history to be inclusive. We do tend to see that coming out of that broader population. That they want their own stories or people like them reflected in the history. They also really appreciate when it enhances their sense of place when they go, when they travel somewhere or in their own community. They want control over the experience. This is why they really don't like guided tours, because they feel like they've lost control over the experience. They want to be able to control it and say, I'm going to choose this, I'm going to choose this, and then have that autonomy. It shouldn't feel like work. It should still be fun, even if it still has meaning, but it needs to be honest and inclusive. And that's something that came out repeatedly, that sense of that need for inclusion. And we do continue to see this in the broader population. So, no surprise then that lack of inclusion can be a barrier to history engagement. It's rooted in how history has been taught in school for decades, but it's continuing to affect how history is presented or how history is perceived to be presented today. So even if a historic site is doing an incredibly fantastic job of inclusive history, that doesn't mean the public perceives that that's happening. They may not even know, because they just assume that history is being taught the way they learned it in school 30 years ago or however many years ago. So that perception is also a really important thing to be thinking about. Okay, so let's talk about patriotism. And I promised we would come back to that. There are three main definitions that we're working with here. And this is coming out of scholarship from the University of Washington here in Seattle. That blind patriotism, we already talked about, that's that more traditional viewpoint. And that's where we have that concrete and uncritical support of national policies and practices, which can be rooted in American nationalism. So that's that far right nationalism in particular. This view of blind patriotism increases affection for in groups. What that means is that it increases affection for people who have a similar viewpoint, and usually pushes aside people who have a different viewpoint. This is where we see a lot in the political divides, that people who are blind patriots, the United States is the best country on earth, full stop, tend to say that when somebody's more critical about the United States, you're not patriotic, you are not a real American, or something like that. And we see that in our political discourse a lot as well. So this is where that's coming from. So that's that blind patriotism. Symbolic patriotism is much more nuanced, it's more abstract, and it's effective attachment to our nation and its core values, but it separates out that affection from the support of its institutions and policies. So we can say things like the United States is a great country, but we haven't lived up to our values yet. I don't like what the United States is doing at the border, but I still love my country. So we have that more critical and nuanced view. It also says, they say things like the United States is a great country, but so are others. That being a great country does not preclude other countries from being great. The third category, which we don't have a really catchy name for, is basically people who have minimal or no patriotic identity at all. Some could just say, where I was born is just a random chance, and why does that make me any better or different than anybody else anywhere born on the planet? So it could be people who just kind of feel that way. My husband fits in that category. It also can include people who feel betrayed by the United States. Generally, the people in this segment often feel that there are other countries who do a better job than the United States. So it's just a very different kind of feeling around that. Okay, so those are those definitions we've been working with. When we looked at those values, though, there's what we tend to think of as American values, which we're going to come back to whether they really are. The one really uniting value was freedom. Pretty much across the spectrum, whether they were blind patriots or symbolic patriots, whether they were traditional or that more neoteric progressive group, freedom was a uniting value. We all kind of get around and say, yes, we're a country that we value freedom. However, the other values that we were testing and looking at tend to have pretty big splits. And that more traditional cluster tended to like those values around liberty, courage, the idea of the American dream, and American exceptionalism. They also really valued opportunity. Now, at first, when we were looking at the research, and we were just looking at the numbers, this looked like a uniting value. But then what we found is that there were some really different definitions of opportunity, interpretations of that idea of opportunity, that we ended up putting this more on that traditional side. It was not a uniting value, but it was actually used by that more traditional cluster to explain away inequality. So that ended up being, no, it's not uniting at all. There were some other written comments that came out from that qualitative work, such as self-reliance and work ethic. That was brought up quite a bit from more traditionally minded individuals. And that idea of religion and sacrifice. I mean, those are some pretty strong words, especially sacrifice. That's a really big word, but that definitely much more on that traditional cluster using that word. That more neoteric or progressive cluster, they tend to talk more about equality, diversity, and tolerance. And they also tend to write in this idea that America does not live up to our founding values. We are that work in progress. There was also some pushback about that there was such a thing as American values in the first place. And here we have this comment. This is from a museum goer. There are not any particular values that I would associate with being uniquely American. For example, concepts such as courage, honor, duty, freedom, ingenuity, creativity, etc., can be found in many people, no matter what country they live in. So we ended up with these takeaways. Now, when it comes to that American identity, that traditional cluster really prefers an America that aligns with their traditional values, and that tends to make them blind patriots. They also desired what they would perceive as a benign status quo. Now, we know the status quo isn't necessarily benign, but they perceive it as benign. The word tolerance for them, different definition than how a lot of other people use it. Tolerance is something you might grit your teeth and put up with. They'll say things like, we are not hyphenated Americans. We are just Americans. They also articulate that people of color should assimilate into existing mainstream culture, which of course, mainstream culture is largely white heteronormative culture. They had desire for unity and a common story, but that unity and common stories tends to be celebratory and not that inclusive. It's basically a common story that they're choosing what that story is and want everybody else to fold into it. Some, and here we are getting to people who are less inclusive, some are really fighting hard for a celebratory white history. And we see that playing out a lot in states and at school boards across the country now. And that means deliberately avoiding or loudly condemning more inclusive stories. That's going to be on the far fringes of this more traditional cluster, but they are very loud and vocal, and we hear a lot from them. Overall, though, people in the traditional cluster are actually less likely to visit history museums. That said, there is a segment of frequent history museum goers that are still very much in this traditional cluster. That more neoterical progressive cluster, their vision of America tends to promote equality and diversity. That tends to make them symbolic patriots or not to have patriotic identity at all. And they desired a more inclusive America. Tolerance means acceptance. And so that grit your teeth and put up with it is acceptance. So it's a very different definition. That we are all our own cultures and identities, and there are many stories that contribute to our country's story. Equity matters. They're actually more likely to visit history museums either casually or regularly. Okay, so all of this affects how they're viewing the past and those lenses of American history. That means, though, that when they think about the past, those values and attitudes that they have affect their perceptions of museum neutrality, which I want to underscore here. There is no such thing as museum neutrality, because what is one person's idea of neutral is very much another person's idea of a position. And so since we can't agree on what neutral is, we can't actually achieve neutrality, even if that was a goal of ours or not. So there is no museum neutrality. We all have different ideas of it. It affects our historical empathy. Who do we care about in the past? Whose perspectives do we bring forward, and who do we show compassion for in the past? How we approach difficult history. What actually is whitewashing of the past? Because both sides tend to accuse the other side of whitewashing the past in different ways. But what does it actually mean? Whether we're sharing everyone's stories or if some stories are more equal than others, to make a little George Orwell allusion there. And then their ideas of race and inclusion and how that matters or not in history. And that, of course, extends to our founding stories. So we asked people, okay, when it comes to the founding of our country, what stories are important? And most people were like, oh yeah, everybody's stories are important. But the traditional cluster was like, everybody's stories are important, but especially the founding fathers. And so here we have this comment. This is not a pleasant comment to read. The founding fathers did a great job. And then they're referring to a very specific museum's exhibit on African Americans in the Revolutionary War. And they were like, oh, this is totally out of proportion, And then you get this line about revisionist history, which that tends to come from the traditional cluster. That more neoteric or progressive cluster felt that, yes, of course, the founding fathers' stories should be included, but they really wanted a more diverse and honest history. And so here we have this very different perspective. They're talking about romanticization of the founding fathers and those founding stories, and wanting to hear a lot more diverse stories as well. But a lot of it boiled down, especially when it comes to the founding of our country, to race. Race becomes an incredibly big flashpoint. And of course, we've seen that happen over the past few years in our headlines and school boards and all of that. So back when we were doing this work, we first started coming up and working with what is a spectrum of attitudes around inclusion. And this is a very early version of it, where this is from 2019, and looking at through the lenses of traditional, middle, or neoteric perspectives, kind of getting that spectrum there. And that really does give you a sense of how there are some really different attitudes playing out here and how these values affect inclusion. So you see that only 16% of those more traditionally clustered individuals want inclusive content. Let's see, my mouse isn't working. There it is. There is 16%. But the majority of people who are in that more neoteric and progressive side do. Now, it's not either or, it's a spectrum. We still have people who are neoteric or progressive who fall on the anti-inclusive side, and we definitely, have those inclusive traditionals as well. So you can't make assumptions about an individual person, but these are the general patterns. We've updated it, we've gotten better, more refined at how we do this work, and now we do it through that political lens. We don't shy away from that. The political values are the number one influence in how people respond to historical content in museums. They're coming in with those political values, and it's deeply affecting their response, whether they like what you're doing or whether they don't like what you're doing. So we can't ignore it. So now we break it down with these conservative values and get a sense again. This is from 2022. We have updates for 2023 that we'll be releasing in the next few weeks. It's a pretty similar breakdown. This is museum goers. And of course, that affects how we're thinking about our country, because everybody wants you to present what they think as a balanced narrative. And this is where you can't be neutral, because there's no such thing as a balanced narrative. Everybody disagrees on what that is. For that traditional cluster, balance is how history is presented in the past. The addition of more inclusive stories, they think, puts it out of balance to the loss of what they consider to be important history. Now, note that important is in quotes, and I'm doing my air quotes here. The word important is code language. It's used by people who are less inclusive to imply a very high threshold, with the implicit understanding that virtually no inclusive content will pass that threshold, therefore privileging white heteronormative content. So what they decide is important is going to be, sure, you can talk about MLK, but not really there's no need to go much further than that, because all the rest of those players were not that important. So we look for that important language, that word important. When somebody says the word important to you, pause for a second and go, what are they talking about here? And try to contextualize with what they're saying, because it could be that coded language coming into play. Another word that's often used is real. Like, tell us the real history. It's also used around art a lot. For real art is basically white, European, or North American, primarily created by men art, and everything else isn't real art. So just look for that coded language. We actually have a glossary we're starting to work on of coded language and defense mechanisms that are used to kind of try to push aside more inclusive content. So that's that traditional cluster. Balance for the more progressive or neoteric cluster, they're saying how history is presented in the past was imbalanced. We need more inclusive stories to put closer to balance today. And that's why there's no neutral. You can't get there even if you wanted to. So this affects 2026. First, the good news. The majority of Americans do want to mark the 250th. And here is one of the first questions we actually had out in the survey. And at that point, we were using the word celebrate. We're not going to use that word now. But in the question, we use the word celebrate. Will you do anything to celebrate the 250th? So these red bars, these big red bars, are the museum goers. We would say yes, and probably adds up to about 90%. And then the gray bars, that's the broader population. That's about 2/3. So yes, the majority of people do want to mark that 250th. Enthusiasm wasn't universal, and they had different ideas about how. So that traditional cluster were much more enthusiastic. Let's throw a big party. So here's that celebratory approach to the past. Grand celebrations, not even celebrations, grand celebrations throughout the year. People who are more neoteric or progressive were a little more muted, willing to entertain options presented. It's a very different approach and different response. Or really are like, I am not that interested in this piece of history. I really don't care. So we have that kind of response as well. So when it came to that 250, and thinking about that more traditional cluster, much more enthusiastic. It's a celebration, positive stories of our founding and our values, developing pride, that sense of developing pride and feeling like there's a pride gap today is coming out. Honoring those founding fathers, that sense of sacrifice. Here's that big word again, sacrifice, and unity. Unity of our nation. That more neoteric or progressive cluster, they were more thoughtful and inclusive, and they talked about it as a commemoration. We're marking the date. This is an important day of our country. We're going to commemorate it, but celebration is maybe not the right thing for them. Extending it beyond the founding fathers, embracing differences as being one of the wonderful things about our country, that diverse history. And then there's a lot of comments about how we are a work in progress and using this moment to perhaps push that work further along. So what were the outcomes? And so here we're going to see some of those different outcomes banging up against each other. That traditional segment, they were talking about pride, pride and love for our country, versus that more neoteric, we need to be doing better. We need to become better. By the time this is over, it's 2027, we need to be better. The traditional cluster, they want unity. They want Americans to be one again. That sense of what it was in the past is what unity is. Versus equity, that more neoteric cluster, we're talking about equity and addressing inequities of the past and today. So there's a big difference there. And that traditional cluster, we're hoping for that focus on greatness, pride, maintaining rights and liberties, maintaining them. That comes out quite a bit, honoring the past, and for some, religion and bringing religion back into the public sphere. So here we have a comment that really addresses that, acknowledging God as the divine inspiration for our founding documents and the need for our culture to return to a moral society. Really encouraging to go read some Thomas Jefferson, but that is where we're seeing that those ideas coming from, versus that more neoteric and more progressive viewpoint that focus on inclusion, diversity, equity, even talking about things like fighting climate change. Fair elections were coming up quite a bit. And this was before the election. More equality for all, more universal care for citizens, and acceptance and appreciation of diversity and its beneficial effects to our society. Those are very different comments and viewpoints. So that the big takeaways is that the traditional cluster, they're excited and enthusiastic about the 250th. So long as some of your programming engages them, they're probably going to be pretty good with that. For them, it is positive and celebratory. They wanted to focus on things that do unite us. So freedom does. Just that acknowledgement of the value of history. And then things we all enjoy, I jokingly call these the 3 Fs: food, fireworks, and family. That's, they talked about pie. They talked about things like that. I mean, so thinking of those more celebratory kind of aspects of noting the July 4th in general, but taking it up a notch or two. For that more progressive neoteric cluster, they want to have that more inclusive and even meaningful content as well. Encourage critical assessment of how our country is doing and fulfilling our values. More inclusive of a much more diverse population. For them, a purely celebratory experience will read as insensitive. They want more thoughtful balance of fun, but also inclusive activities. So thinking about how do you frame the 250th in these ways that traditional audiences can feel good about, while also giving those more skeptical neoteric audiences something to feel pride in. And so our potential messaging themes, it's a commemoration. It's an exploration of freedom. give people a sense that we are striving to achieve freedom and equality of opportunity for all in America. This is a little bit of a flashpoint. The traditional cluster says we actually achieved equality in the past, and now we're becoming less equal to white people. That a lot of you will disagree with that for a good reason, but that's a viewpoint that they'll have there. But generally, that sense of striving to achieve freedom and equality for everyone. We have to know our history to achieve those values. Americans can help be part of that process by making that better American future through history and the inclusion of all stories. Keep in mind that the larger traditional cluster includes a lot of people who don't go to museums at all or are not inclined to do so. When it comes to being very practical in terms of growing audiences, they're the least likely to become visitors. It's just not where the inclinations are for that very traditional cluster for the most part, with the exception of those who are already visiting and who are already pretty well engaged. Where it comes to the opportunity for growth, the interest in visiting history and historic sites, that growth can be found with that more neoteric cluster. That's where you're going to be able to grow your audiences. And of course, that neoteric cluster is more diverse, it's more inclusive, and they're also looking for that mission that we're still striving for that more perfect union. So how do you do this? I'm not going to leave you with just like big ideas and then go, I have no idea how to do this. This is where we have a little bit of an update. And this is coming from Audiences Inclusion, the primer on inclusive practice. It's a free download. This is a separate document. It's a little book. Free download. You can get it off of the AAM website, and we can make sure you have the link to get that entire book. But at the end of that book, there is a 10-step guide to sharing history or sharing inclusive content with audiences. And it's really intended to be thinking about that middle group, that status quo group that might be persuadable. They're not looking for changes, but they might be pretty open to changes if they're done and paced a way that they can be persuaded to join in. So we're thinking about that middle group. And I actually have some more updates to these 10 steps and reframing. So you're going to hear me talk about that too. Like this first step, step 1, acknowledge your bias in the beginning and encourage your visitors to do likewise. Yes, I still think this is super important. We all need to be better at acknowledging our own biases. And that's us as we design content. And it's also our visitors need to do so as well. And we do find in research that when we ask people to think about and articulate their biases, they can, and they do. And most people realize we're human beings. I would not publicly use the word bias, though. I would instead talk about things like values. Here are our values as an organization. That maybe they're board approved values that they're going to be that foundation of the work that we're doing, and posting those values so that people see them when they come into your organization. And then that's where you say, this is how we're presenting this content is based on this set of values. It also means doing things like saying, who are the people behind your exhibitions and who are the people behind your programs? So that way people can see where you're coming from and have a better sense of where this program is coming from also contextually. So you don't have to do a big bias statement, though I have done bias statements in the past, but just really we want to signal ways. And then you want to ask visitors to think about what are the values they're bringing in with them that might be affecting how they're going to engage with this content today. Okay, step 2. This is where we get into psychology, and I do want to make clear I am not a psychologist, but I do look a lot at psychology research. One of the things that's really a helpful tactic for opening up people's mindsets is to use certain language at the beginning of an experience that opens up their mind view. So here we talk about reinforce their aspirational identity as curious, open-minded, and or well-rounded individuals. Pretty much everybody, if you ask them, hey, are you a curious person? Yes. Are you an open-minded person? Of course I am. Are you well-rounded? Yes, I try to be. Yes. I mean, it's one of those things that most people are like, yes. If you were asking them directly, they would say they were those things. What's interesting is that when you tell people they are those things, they're actually more likely to live up to the values associated with those things. This can also be deployed with very young children, like a 3 or 4-year-old. When my kids were young, I learned this trick and they helped set the table. I didn't say, hey, thanks for helping. I said, thanks for being a good helper. Oh, yes, I'm a helper. Yeah. It makes them more likely they're going to help the next time. Same thing. Thank you so much for coming here today. You must be a really curious person. Yes, I am. Already, just that little trick. They're going to go into your content with a little bit more of an open mind. It's not going to open it completely. It's just going to open it up a little bit, and that helps. Now, here's where I'm going to give you a caution. This is a very powerful tool. Use it only for good and never for evil. Okay, next step. Now that you've sparked their you've told them that they're curious, you actually have to spark their curiosity. You want to open up and have them start thinking about new things that they hadn't actually considered before. Create information gaps that they then need to close. That helps them become more comfortable with ambiguity or uncertainty, which is a really important thing about learning. And it's just an extension of that opening of the worldview. That primer talks about how to do this. So go back and look at that primer. You can learn a little bit more about curiosity, and you'll get more about that. Okay, so now everybody knows their biases. They've acknowledged their biases. Now you've told them they're curious. Now you're actually sparking their curiosity. Now we get to questions. Now, have we gotten to content yet? No. We're on step 4, and there's been no content yet. We're still thinking about questions. We want to, everybody kind of comes in with their, even their unconscious questions about the content. You want to change those questions. Because if you don't change those questions, they're going to cherry pick the information that answers those questions and ignores everything else that you actually want them to pick up. You want to open up those questions to new questions. Consider this as a great tactic for opening somebody up to a new question. Sparking that curiosity, information gaps, those are new questions. And here's a really hard part, especially when you're interacting with someone who has a different worldview than you. And they're coming with very different sets of values. And so you want to open up their worldviews, yes. You still have to practice what we call courageous empathy, by being open to their answers when they answer the questions or when they find those answers. Because if you don't give them that mutual respect, you've lost your ability to engage with them meaningfully. Okay. Finally, now we're getting to step 5, which is content. Now they have new questions and they're looking for new things to answer those questions. That's when you give them the information. And that's where you go to the facts. That's where you're presenting your footnoted content. That is going to be in multiple perspectives. Telling the truth, even when it changes our understanding of the past, and trusting those audiences with those facts and those changed understandings. So what we do tend to see from more traditional audiences is this approach of they'll say, just give me the facts and I will make up my own mind. So if we had facts as the first step, they've made up their mind and they've moved on. You want to open up that worldview to more inclusive stories. You have to do all that work before you even get to the facts. So then hopefully when they get to the facts and all of those facts that you're presenting, they can draw conclusions that are more honest about the past. Which means you also have to show your work. Where's your stuff coming from? How can they trust it if they don't know the sources that you're using? One of the things that personally I find very difficult in museums is that museums don't provide sources for the most part. We need to footnote our exhibitions and put a way that people can go find the sources. Even if nobody follows the footnote and goes to find the source, the fact that you make it easy for them to do so in theory increases credibility. Or you can even say, hey, thanks for taking this tour today. If you want to see a list of the sources that we consulted to develop this tour, you can get it from this QR code or this handout at the front desk or on our website, wherever it is. Show your work. Step 7, mainstream inclusive content, and never, ever, ever apologize for being inclusive. Ever. Some of our clients have made this their new step 1. They've reordered the steps. They're just going to say from the beginning, we will never apologize for being inclusive. Pacing. This is a hard one for a lot of us. Pace your work at the speed of trust. You can't expect someone who's ambivalent about something like inclusive history to suddenly be 100% on board. Not going to happen. It's going to overwhelm them. They may actually end up rejecting what you're trying to do. Sometimes it's more important to help get them on the pathway in the first place. That's actually the hardest step. And that is the work that we can do really well. So how do we help get more people onto that pathway towards inclusive history? And how do we do it in ways that do not make them feel dumb and that we're not preaching at them? Step 9, be a place for civil discourse. This one's really tricky. Most people do not expect or want museums to be doing this. This is actually a theme of the 2023 annual survey, and there's some interesting results there. We're going to look at a little bit of that in a moment. But when museums do it, we can do it really well, and it can really help. And then finally, this is the final hard recognition. Your visitors are human. You're human. I'm human. We all have our biases. There will be controversy. We can't avoid it. If we can't even agree on what neutral is, how can we avoid controversy? We're going to have it. So accept that no matter what, despite your best efforts, you're not going to be 100% successful in what you're trying to do. There will be people who will not accept a more complete and inclusive history. Sorry. But hopefully we can get more people onto that pathway. Okay, so a couple final thoughts and the sneak peek at the new research. Here's just that recap. Now you pretty much have gotten this understanding of how our values and attitudes and beliefs affect everything when it comes to the past in our country. And we have this lovely quote. You can read it later. You can download this. Okay, let's bring it up to 2023. Viewpoints around American democracy and our founding and civic engagement continue to evolve. So here is some data from the Pew Research Center, which shows, and here this is very much political Republican Democrat, and their viewpoint of voting. Very different attitudes here on whether voting is a privilege or a fundamental right. And if you think about all the voting controversies and through this lens, you go, oh, this makes a lot more sense now why this is coming up this way. Okay. Of course, we had the events of January 6th. The Arizona Republican Party's anti-democracy experiment. This is an article from the New York Times Magazine. There was also an excellent op-ed just this past weekend by Jamel Bowie on a similar topic, saying that when you have a far extreme opinion that is controlling a political party, but they are very much in the minority of the US population, democracy is just not going to be something they're in favor of because that doesn't work for them, for their viewpoints. And it's that idea of being ruled by the minority. That minority viewpoint is what some Republicans are trying to go for now. So there's a lot of these ideas circulating. You can find them as well. But this is the one from the New York Times a year ago. Meanwhile, this is from November 27th, the Georgia senatorial runoff election. And you had people standing in line for hours to vote. Something that caught my eye was this from February. So this is just a few months ago. This is from a conservative think tank, the Claremont Institute. And it was just an article about field trip programming at historic sites. And it said pretty much what you would expect for a far-right conservative think tank to talk about in terms of field trips. But this is what caught my eye. A more concerning element of the curriculum is the promotion of advocacy in the lesson plan on the failure of Reconstruction. Students are asked to write a letter to the editor because letters to the editor are great advocacy tools. After you write letters to your members of Congress, sending letters to the editor can achieve other advocacy goals. This doesn't want children to learn how to engage in the civic process of things like writing letters to the editor or writing to members of Congress, not having that civic voice. So civic participation was the theme of this year's annual survey. At the time we did these slides, this was back in March in Virginia. I had pulled data on March 8th. We now have well over 100,000 responses. But statistically, they're pretty close. So you can look at this and go, yeah, okay, this is what we see. You can have some good confidence here. So we asked these questions. One is, which of the following do you think are important things people should do to be a good member of society? We're not even saying anything about museums in this question. This is just, what does it mean to be a good member of society? The average person picked 5 of these choices, 5.5. The traditional segment, we were able to just kind of run some filters and get to them. They chose fewer, 4.5 versus 6 for that neoteric. Much higher on patriotism, pretty much the same on voting. But if you look at all these other things, they were significantly lower on all of them. That neoteric segment was kind of the opposite, much lower on patriotism, which we would expect, more symbolic patriots. Matched top line on community activities and voting. So those two, they're about like everybody else, much higher on everything else. So we see these different perspectives on things like advocating politically or participating in protests or conserving natural resources. So we have these very different viewpoints. It gets more extreme though. When I ask about museums, the role museums playing in building a civil society you want to be a part of. The average person selected 2.8 items, but the traditional segment, on average, they chose 1.5 of these choices versus 3.5 for that neoteric segment. So they're just not choosing as many things. But nearly half of the traditional segment said, I don't think museums should be doing any of these things. Less than 5% of the neoteric segment said the same thing. So very different ideas about the role of museums in our civil society. The traditional segment want museums to be divorced from it. The neoteric segment doesn't see how you can be. Very different perspectives. And then, which of the following best describes how you think museums should or should not be places of civic participation? There's overall results. Again, the traditional segment, about half think museums should stay out of civic participation and action entirely, whereas less than 5% of the neoteric segment said that. And finally, this one isn't about civic engagement. This is about feeling connected to humanity, broader humanity. The traditional segment chose far fewer of them, but nearly half actually said, to be honest, I don't think this is the role of museums. Museums, which are about human history and human culture and what it means to be human, should not help people develop a connection to humanity. That more neoteric or progressive segment, they were like, oh yeah, they were all over this question. And they were often 2.5 to 5 times more likely to make some of these choices here. And if you look at some of these choices, you're like, why wouldn't we want museums to motivate visitors to make the world a better place? So we see these really big divides, not only on the history, but also on civic engagement, civic participation, our civil discourse, our civil society, what it means to be human. These divides are just really extending to a lot of different things. And presents a really interesting conundrum. The audience that's most excited about the 250th is also the least likely to want museums and historic sites to explore civic engagement in our shared humanity. While that more progressive neoteric segment is most skeptical of the 250th, but the most enthusiastic about empowering civic engagement and connecting to broader humanity through their museum experiences. How do we reconcile this? How do we navigate that increasingly complex landscape? And that's where I'm going to leave you, because that's where we are in the research. We've just fielded that 2023 research. We pulled that data from the field, and we are just about to start that analysis. And so we're going to be looking at and sharing all of that work over the coming months through our website and also AAM's website, where we share the annual survey data. Okay, because I like to show my work, there is a whole long list of external sources that helped us understand what we were finding in our research. And then here is my contact information. We'll make sure we put that into the chat for you as well. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And I know we have some comments in the chat, and I don't know if there's any Q&A. So Cindy, hopefully you looked at that.
We haven't had anything come through yet, but feel free to throw any questions in the Q&A, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand and I can turn on your camera. Thanks, Kyra.
Oh, and you already found the link to the primer. Awesome.
Yeah. And I will just in a moment throw your contact info in there as well. But I think everyone would agree that this was really informative. Oh, here we go. So this may be a naive question, but given this information, what is the incentive for museums and art museums especially to spend resources commemorating the 250th?
Okay, but I think for an art museum, it would really depend on the art museum too. Because I mean, obviously, if this is an art museum with an American collection, how we express and think about our country through art could certainly come into play right there with it. Would I expect an art museum to be as enthusiastic a participant as I would say a historic site? Probably not. But I think there's certainly ways that we can think about art and culture and how American identity deeply affects not only the production of art and culture in our country, but also the consumption of art and culture in our country. I think there could be some really interesting ideas to play with. Should an art museum do a big exhibit? Maybe, maybe not. That's going to be up to that art museum and their mission. But I think there could be some very good programming ideas to explore that one lens of the American experience, certainly. However, go into it just like with everything else, pretty much, that right now there is a segment of the population that is looking for things to complain about. We don't want to over amplify certain things. But we do need to be ready for that pushback, whether it's publicly in the middle of the museum gallery, publicly in our community, or whether it's one-on-one where it's someone complaining to a frontline staff member about it. And that's not just for the 250th, that's just in general, because right now, so much is contentious that even innocent questions can feel partisan. So one of the phrases that I've been using more and more, and we just put out a data story this morning about climate change, and we use the phrase in there, is that what tends to happen is that people who don't like the content that you're sharing, here I'm particularly thinking about the far right, but the far left can do it too. So I don't want to only point to the far right, but it's just more likely from them, is that whenever they start feeling uncomfortable with the content that you're sharing, they immediately tend to go to the word political. Don't get political. That's not your job. How dare you? Really putting you on the defensive really immediately. You're like, ah! However, that use of the word political, what we're finding is that it is used as a means to shut down a conversation that actually we really, really need to be having. It's a defense mechanism because they're uncomfortable. If we know that, so when we do then hear that, then that gives us the time to start thinking about that response and be ready for our response. Because to be honest, that means that everything's political, and everything is political. Our civil society is inherently political. But you just need to be ready for that pushback and how you word and frame those responses.
We have another question. So what's the number one finding museums should keep in mind as we move forward with program planning?
There is no neutral. I think we all knew that though. But that I would say the number one finding is just that human acknowledgement that you're human, everybody else is coming in human with very different perspectives, and that you will never be able to manage them all, but that you need to develop the tools to manage most of those emotions that come up from whatever you're doing. Because if you can't do that, then you're not going to be able to effectively share content. And I don't think most of us go into museum work thinking that's what we have to do. We're excited about history. We're excited about art. We're excited about science. If we're not acknowledging those very different responses, then we're not going to be effective in our work. So there's a couple of data stories that we've created that might help you think through that. I am going to put the overall link into the chat right now. But the ones I think can be really helpful for you to be thinking about, they're actually close to the top of the page right now. One is called Connection to Humanity. We're going to pick at that part a little bit more. And then also this one, the next two, amplification versus over-amplification and respecting visitor values, audience perceptions. Those three together, that's where we really start going into those emotions and those values that people come into museums with, so that we as practitioners can better navigate them and work with them when people are in the museum. The one that I think is actually hardest for us sometimes is the amplification versus over amplification. And that's where we hear that critical comment. Let's say we have 40 comments from a program and 20 are, this was great. And 15 are like, yeah, they're kind of neutral. Glad you did this. Good work, whatever. And then there's that one. And what's the comment that you're going to remember and obsess about for weeks? The one comment that from somebody who is racist or somebody who's just really cranky that day or whatever it is. That's over amplification. And we all do it. We're human beings, and it's our nature to over amplify that one negative comment, ignore all the good ones. So this data story hopefully helps you try to manage our responses to those kinds of things, so then you are ready to deal with any kind of pushback that you might be getting, and you can contextualize and you can take those deep breaths and then move forward in the way that you and your organization want to move forward. That's probably the big takeaways. It's a lot of managing our own emotions as well as those of our visitors.
Another question. So if we don't have a museum but want to commemorate in 2026, what 3 themes or events should we focus on?
Oh. I mean, freedom. I mean, that's a good easy one. But I think that can be a launch pad for talking about freedom in many different ways. Identity as a theme. Ooh, identity is a very political word now, but yes, because that gets really but yes. I think, the idea that we're a country where we are free to express our love of country in many different ways could be something that is both positive but also provocative, and might be a way to open up people's ideas of, this is how I think about it, but other people are thinking about it in different ways. So I wouldn't be using the word identity, but still would be bringing that in. Because a lot of what we want to do isn't so much getting people suddenly way down the path towards they're all gung ho on inclusive history, but we just want to get them on that pathway. So what are those ways to get people on the pathway? What are those ways, that speed of trust, to open up those mindsets and those worldviews so that they're really, really ready to take those steps forward? There's a book I read recently that talked about that middle group as being persuadables. And the way that they talked about them is they tend to look at and think about, they'll have this response, like they'll hear something from one side of the political spectrum and they go, that's a really good point, which might make them lean more one way or the other. And then somebody else would make a very different point, and they go, oh, that's a good point too. And that could say, oh yeah, that's a really good point too. So they're persuadable because they're really open to all those good points. And it's not a bad trait, because in some ways that makes them a little bit more open-minded, more nuanced than the people who are hardened on the ends of the spectrums. But to make good points, make really good points, back up your points with your sources. Make those good points in ways that those persuadable people are like, yes, that's a good point. And I think if you focus on that a bit, that's going to help people move forward. And that's you have resources and themes for the commission. We're going to be coming out. We are working through a lot of our data right now. We're going to be coming out with the civic engagement, in particular, resources probably by this fall, largely because people are not looking for research in the summer. We just start releasing in the fall. So we'll have more insights about some of these, more of the civics side of things in the fall.
And then we have another question. What most surprised you in this research?
I think, especially since, I did this research, and then I hadn't looked at it in a while when I had to go present it down in Virginia a couple months ago. So I pulled it out and was looking at a week or two before I went down there. And I think what surprised me most at that point was how prescient it was, because already you could see those traces of discontent, especially on the right, more traditional side, about how we talk about history in this country. And that was before we started seeing everything kind of explode with schools. And then, Donald Trump had that 2026 commission report, whatever it was, that came out. I don't remember what it was called, but I know Biden kiboshed it in the first hours of him taking office, which I was like, yay. But it was all about that more traditional celebratory history. I said that if we're paying attention to what people are saying and asking really good questions to get at how people are feeling, it is kind of our crystal ball into the future. And so I think that's the surprise, is that it played out a lot like what they were talking about then, which doesn't actually make me feel that great, since it's not how I wanted it to happen.
There are a couple of comments into the chat that were sent to hosts and panelists only. So just making sure everybody has the link to those data stories. A comment from Jason: while not from the Declaration, how might we think about framing common good in the context of nationhood and democracy as we move forward?
Now I'm wondering if we can agree what the common good is. Good question. Also, I'm going to make a note. I am going to do a search and see if anybody, because we have tens of thousands of comments in the 2023 annual survey. I'm going to look for the phrase common good and see if it comes up from anyone, and if it does, who it's coming up from and how they're talking about it. Okay.
It looks like the questions have died down. I'm going to also throw in the chat a link to sign up for our mailing list for the 250th. We've got that up and running, and we're going to start doing monthly newsletters in June so that we can keep everyone informed, share resources, and move forward here in Connecticut. And Susie's information is also in the chat if anyone has any additional questions that they want to reach out to her directly. But thank you so much for sharing this and being so open to questions and everything going on right now.
It's hard. It's a hard job right now to be in history museums, and it's even a harder job to be a history educator right now. So lots of deep breaths. You're doing good work.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Susie.